What is geographic perspective? In this lesson, you're going to learn to investigate like a geographer. Geographic perspective, it's a way that we understand a topic or an area using spatial features and relationships. So how are things related to one another in spatial terms? We're going to acquire, understand, and use a variety of perspectives that are essential to making you geographically informed. So to be a geographical thinker, you're going to have to see and utilize these different perspectives. The first one is a spatial perspective. That's the way we identify, explain, and predict human and physical patterns in a space, as well as how they are connected or their interconnectedness. Spatial perspective. So basically when we're thinking about spatial perspective, we're saying, where is it? Why is it there? And why should I care? So those are the questions that a geographer is thinking about when they think spatially. So an example might be getting a new city. Why would you get a new city? So what would cause a country or state to need a new city? If there's a need, how do you decide where you're going to build the new city? An example is when South Carolina decided they needed new capitals. So their first settlement, which was Charlestown, now we know it as Charleston, that became the center of all their trade. It was the wealthiest city, and it was the largest city south of Philadelphia. It made sense that Charlestown was the capital of South Carolina. But because it was a wealthy port, it left them vulnerable to both attack on land and sea. People wanted to come and get the goods that they had there, so on and so forth. So they were looking for a safer and an area that was more centrally located. That led them to Columbia, the new capital of South Carolina. So here you can see Charleston as the capital. And on this map, you can see that the capital has moved to Columbia. Okay, so some things had to go into consideration, spatial consideration, when we were deciding whether or not to have a new capital. An ecological perspective. So when we talk about an ecological perspective, we're learning about how humans are connected to non-living and other living things on Earth. So we've got two conditions here. We have humans modifying the physical environment, so we physically change the environment. We move mountains to build roads. We dry up water to build a hotel. But the physical world also places some constraints on human activities. So the world itself does things that keep humans from being able to do things. So for instance, there could be an earthquake. We're not going to be able to use lands if we know that they're frequent in earthquakes. Okay, so that would be an example of the physical world placing a constraint on human activity. All right, so when we talk about ecological perspective, something we have to think about is population density. So when we talk about population, there's geographic distribution, density, growth rate, and age structure. These are all important characteristics when we're thinking of population. Geographic distribution or range is the area a population inhabits. The density is the number of individuals that live per unit area. So the number of people living in a square mile would be an example. And population density is the number of individuals divided by the unit area. So let's try this example. Let's say you're in the classroom and there's 10 students in your classroom. And you've got to figure out the area of your room. So let's say your room is just a 10 by 10. So 10 times 10 is 100 square feet is how big your room is. And there are 10 people. So we're going to take 10 people, divide it by 100, and that's going to give us 0.1 persons per, and this says square mile, it would actually be square feet. Okay, so there's 0.1, 1/10 of a person per square foot. Let's look at another one. Okay, suppose there are 150 bullfrogs living in a pond that covers an area of 3 square miles. What is the density of the bullfrog population? Okay, so we've got 150 bullfrogs, and they live in 3 square miles. So we take 150 divided by 3. That's going to give us 50 bullfrogs per square mile. That's the population density. So one of the things we have to think about when we're thinking about population is that the growth refers to how quickly a population is increasing or decreasing in size. The growth rate depends on how many people are added to the population or how many are removed from the population. So people are added to the population by being born or through immigration. That's the movement of individuals to an area. Okay, so people might immigrate to that area. People are removed from the population through death and also through immigration. Notice that's pronounced the same way, but this immigration is when people move out of an area. So let's say that I decided to move to New York City tomorrow. I would be immigrating to New York City. So I would be an immigrant in New York, but I would also be an immigrant from South Carolina. Okay? All right, if a population has unlimited resources, meaning there's all the resources they could possibly need, and there's very few predators and disease, it's going to grow what we call exponentially. And exponential growth is shown by this J shape, right? And when the population slows or stops for a period, we call that logistic growth. So here you can see the logistic growth. It's represented by an S shape. And then this curvy part up here, when it stops growing, we call that carrying capacity. So what is carrying capacity? It's the number of individuals of a particular species, that could be frogs, it could be humans, that a given environment can support. So here you can kind of see that this is all it can hold. This is all this cup can hold. And so, you've got starvation and accidents, predators and hunting, disease and parasites, old age, loss of habitat, human development, weather, annual reproduction. All of these are things that influence the population. Well, when you see this spill out, this excess of population, we have reached our carrying capacity. We can no longer provide resources for the people in the environment. So let's take a look at this human population growth of 2018. So scale influences usefulness of data for planning purposes. So you can look here and see that this is going to kind of show you like how many people are living in different areas. This is a world map and based on the color. So when you get down here to this darker area, these are saying per square kilometer, 1,500 to 9,000 people, which is a pretty wide range. That's how many people are living in a square kilometer, which is just over a mile. Okay, so human population data can help people plan where they want to live. If you live in a more crowded area, it might cost you more. So sometimes we want to know, what is the population density like? That can help us make some decisions. Here we can see the J curve again, the world reaching their carrying capacity. Many geographers believe that we are going to reach our carrying capacity, that we're on our way to making this J curve here. Okay, so this is year 2000. And in 2019, we are up to 7.7 billion people in the world. Okay. All right, our next perspective, civic perspective. So how are civics, things like that are your civic duty, your obligation to your country and your environment and where you live, how are those connected to geographic questions? So, people have to make decisions every day. And when you have civic knowledge, that helps you as a citizen understand, like the interests of individuals or groups or individuals as members of groups. And it's very important that citizens participate in civic environmentalism. Okay, so if we want to reduce environmental problems, citizens have to be involved. They have to come together, they have to discuss options, and then they have to work towards resolving those problems. And sometimes you see this taking place like in city meetings or with city communities, things of that nature. So again, people making decisions, and the idea of civic environmentalism, it's a type of social action where citizens try to solve the problems of their community that relate to the environment. This usually starts with the community planning and then identifying things. And then once they've identified the problems, then they decide how they want to solve those problems and proceed in the future if they want to be successful with it. Citizens, businesses, nonprofits, local governments, all of these people can come together in a planning process to help address environmental issues. So here's a thought. Should we protect scenery? Are these things that would be environmental issues? And as citizens, should we be concerned with what we're seeing? Some zoning requirements. How do cities make plans for the lands in their city? Is that something that the citizens should have a voice in? Okay, this would be a civic perspective. An economic perspective. That's learning how economics are connected to geographic questions. So one of the biggest things that comes to mind is scarcity. What is scarcity? Scarcity is basically saying that there are limited resources to satisfy the human wants and needs. So when you look at this picture, I think you can see here that water is scarce. He's not going to be able to dig down and find a water well here. So water is scarce. Do we have enough water to satisfy the needs and wants of humans? Another thought on scarcity is energy. So this graphic here is looking at Japan's energy sources. So in 1973, they were 94% dependent on fossil fuels. Okay, in 2010, they were 81% dependent on fossil fuels. And in 2017, they are 87% dependent on fossil fuels. So, when you think about fossil fuels, and they're a very small country, are they going to run out of these supplies, and are they dependent on other countries for those supplies? So that also relates to scarcity. Are there enough resources to supply the human needs and wants? And a historic perspective. A historic perspective is when you try to explain or describe how places change over time. So when we look at this map here, we can see that this is South Carolina's 1710 counties. There they are, 1, 2, 3, 4 in 1710. And then when we jump forward a few years, we can see here is growth. These are now more colonies that are found in South Carolina. This would be closer to present day. So, some things that we might ask ourselves is, why? Why did we get so many more colonies? Why did we go from 4? What drove us to decide we needed to break it up? And if you look closely, you can see that the present day counties are actually behind there. So you can see what county they used to be a part of to our present day. What were the reasons that we felt we needed to divide into those counties? And then here you can see, if you even go up closer, here you can see growth in South Carolina when you look specifically at cities. Okay, so now we're taking a county and then we're looking at the cities that make up that county. So geographic perspective is looking at the world through many lenses. You have a civic lens, an economic lens, an ecological lens, a historic lens, or a spatial lens. This is geographic perspective.